Hello, friends. Welcome to our weekly discussion here on Facebook. I enjoy these, as I hope you do. Happy New Year. First off, it's an interesting day. A lot going on. The House of Representatives, of course, can't get their act together if you're watching live right now. They seem to be having trouble electing a speaker. But hopefully we'll have better luck today getting something accomplished here than they are in Washington. The idea for today's topic, and I know some of you watch live and watch later, and this one came from someone who watched later, was school mascots, because this topic has been in the news. For those who have not been privy to that conversation that's been going on, and this conversation has been happening for years, decades actually. New York State Education Department recently came out with a directive essentially directing school districts that are still maintaining Native American names and mascots, and they've kind of changed the direction on district names or school names, but the mascots, and that's important to us here locally because we have a school district that has a Native American inspired name. But they've directed school districts to eliminate, to phase out Native American imagery and mascots. So that's been in the news, and of course here we have the Iroquois chiefs in the Alma Marilla Wales area, so that's a topic that comes up quite a bit, and you hear people talking about debating whether the mascot should stay or go. And a lot of times people bring up the word tradition and heritage and things like that have been used in an effort to try to maintain a certain mascot or a certain name. And so it's important, I think, if you're going to make arguments like that, if we're going to talk about tradition and heritage and make that argument when it comes to discussing school mascots, we kind of need to know the history of where the mascot started and why certain names were picked or certain imagery was picked. And I've done quite a bit of research into East Aurora's mascot, but also other mascots, just because I found it interesting. When did we start doing it? That sort of thing. So I'm going to start with East Aurora because, believe it or not, as much as we're lately been talking about American Indian, Native American mascots, not only in our local school districts, but of course we had professional football team, and we still do, and college teams, and that debate has been going on. But Native American imagery and mascots are not the only ones that have caused controversy. And as a matter of fact, the Blue Devil of East Aurora has caused controversy as well, from a smaller group, I might say, and not based on different reasons. But in the 1990s, a particular local minister in town, and there was a group of folks who, and I sat through these school board meetings when I was in high school, but they said that they wanted to, they were recommending that we get rid of the Blue Devil. And they were mentioning that it was an inappropriate mascot because it, of course, from a religious perspective, from someone who is a minister of a church or a pastor, that imagery is inappropriate. And they were basically talking about how the image of a devil is inappropriate, and they were making it equal to essentially Satan and the devil from a biblical standpoint. But if we delve into the history of the Blue Devil, we find out that originally it has nothing to do with biblical anything, or even the image of the devil that we kind of see on the floor of the high school gym, or on the wall of the high school gym, and on everything, the sign outside the high school. We see that imagery, but it has nothing to do with it. In fact, and I put the Blue Devil actually in one of my books, Legendary Locals book, as one of the mascots that it's a legendary mascot here in East Aurora, and along with real people, it's sort of become part of our local fabric. But In doing research, discovered that the Blue Devil actually goes back to Duke University, and they actually adopted the Blue Devil first, and East Aurora took it from Duke University. But we even have to go back further. So this is the 1930s that this happened, and we'll get back to that in a bit. But the Blue Devil, and we started off with blue starting back in 1901, and I discovered this by randomly going through looking for something else, which is usually what happens when I'm doing research and I come up with a great topic. It's totally random, and I'm looking for some other article in the newspaper, and another headline will pop up. But in 1901, the East Aurora students at the East Aurora High School voted on the school colors. And classes would have colors, but the school itself didn't, that they would adopt. But the school district itself for the high school would not have colors. And it was sort of a way to, that school officials felt that it would be a way to boost camaraderie and support for the school, make the students feel, something to rally around. They have school colors. We still do that today. So they had two committees. One was a group of female students, and one was a group of male students. The female students picked olive green and white, and the male students picked Yale blue. So there was not just any blue, but Yale University blue. There was a color, and white. And then they put it to the school, to the students to vote, and the boys must have had more support, or there were more boys to vote. Who knows? But the Yale blue and white won back in 1901. So, and the rest they say is history. So the school colors came first. Well, over the years, since the term mascot was actually coined from a French opera, essentially, and I didn't know this, but it basically translates to lucky charm. And you'll see a lot of old pictures of sports teams where the mascot isn't necessarily the Blue Devil or another animal, a bear or anything like that, but it's a lucky charm. And sometimes it was a person, so it would be a young person or a dog, and they would bring the dog to the game, and it would be a lucky charm. And in some instances, you'll hear the story like a dog would be on the sidelines of a game, and the team won, and so they thought, well, bring that dog back. Don't let, we won maybe partly because the dog was there. He's a lucky charm. So the term mascot wasn't necessarily a cartoon image or the same image every time. It was just essentially, it was a lucky charm. But starting in the 30s, 1920s and 30s, universities were starting to come up with actual mascots as we know today. And East Aurora was right on top of this. High schools didn't necessarily do this, but East Aurora quickly followed the lead of universities and colleges. And so in the 1930s, actually 1930, I got to look it up, make sure it's correct, 1934 to be exact, according to newspaper articles about it, a committee had decided secretly on the Blue Devil as the school mascot, and they were taking the Yale blue color, and then they were inspired by Duke University, and the newspaper articles said that. But they had little silhouettes of devils devil faces that they put around the school to get people talking, to boost excitement about it, in December of 1934, and then a game at the school to inaugurate the gym, the West Gym at what is now today the middle school. The team, according to the news reports, came out and they had their warm-up sweaters on. They wore sweaters, and they had little patches of Blue Devils. So that's how it was chosen, a committee, secret committee, and they got everybody excited about it. And of course, the rest is history. And that became our mascot. And then within a couple months and years, they had actually developed a person who would dress up and put this, what would be considered a very primitive Blue Devil head on, made of paper mache probably. And they would along with the cheerleaders and get the crowd going. And that's how we became the Blue Devils. And again, we've had the rest, they say, is history, and we have had the Blue Devil ever since. But of course, in the 1990s, there was this call to get rid of the Blue Devil because of the biblical influence or evil, like it would, that the devil symbolizes evil. But a lot of folks, and I remember this, pointed out that in addition to the fact that the Blue Devil comes from a French fighting team in World War I, and that's what Duke modeled their Blue Devil after, and we did as well in East Aurora, is there was this military unit, a French military unit in France during World War I, and I'm just going to read what they were, a mentally and physically strong French military unit known as the Blue Devils, and of course they had a French name. They were distinguished by their royal blue uniforms, flowing capes, and berets. So they sort of had this look about them, and they were known as the Blue Devils. And a lot of folks pointed out when this controversy came up in the 1990s was that that the devil has several definitions in not only the biblical version, the evil version, but there's a definition that, and I actually looked it up because I wanted to be sure, but in addition to a wicked or cruel person or a chief evil spirit, there was a mischievous, clever, or self-willed person, a strong fighting spirit, among many other definitions. But that was more of the definition for Blue Devil that we were adopting at East Aurora and at Duke University than evil spirit. It was more of the fighting person, the person who self-willed, strong person. That was another definition of devil, and that, of course, would be that by that definition would be probably more of an appropriate mascot because it was, a fighting force, someone who a strong-willed, and of course in athletics, that's what you're, looking at, strong fighting, and in honor of the World War I French unit. So if you look back at the history, of course, perhaps the imagery of the devil that we see is maybe that could be up for debate, and what's included on various walls and on the school websites and things like that. But if you really study the history of it, which a lot of us fail to do, we understand more of what the thinking was back when they adopted the devil as the mascot. So that's why history is important in studying history. Now, if we fast forward to today, and actually in recent years, another local school district, Iroquois, they were actually not centralized until the 1950s, and there were essentially one-room schoolhouses and what they called common schools, so one-room schoolhouses throughout the towns of Alma Marilla in Wales. And in the 1950s, the residents, the voters of that area, voted to centralize the school district. And East Aurora's Union Free School District, we'll talk about that. That's another great topic idea that people had suggested. We'll talk about that. But they voted to centralize. And in the early few years, as they were getting organized, the school district, so essentially it was known as the Alma Marilla Wales Central School District. And they didn't have a school building. They didn't have a high school yet. So students were still going to East Aurora and other adjacent schools, even though the school district had been centralized and formed. So then they had a building project, and they built their schools and had a high school. And in 1953, they had, it's quite interesting, like how did the name Iroquois come along? It was basically, and the East Aurora Advertiser, someone asked me to look this up. They emailed me at the historian's office. And I did find an article about when and why Iroquois became the name in 1953, but a few weeks ago, actually it was the December 15th issue of the East Aurora Advertiser, they did a much better job of finding the original articles. Adam Zaremski, the editor there, wrote this great article about it, and essentially found that there was a contest among students to name the school district. And they ended up naming the school district Iroquois in honor of, and this is what they said, the Native Americans who lived in those three towns before the 1840s. So that's how the name got picked, and these students who came up with the name won a prize. I think they won a savings bond, and the school district became, with not a whole lot of fanfare, actually. The Easter Advertiser had a little article about it, and after a school vote of the residents of the town, they announced in the newspaper that the new name of the school district was Iroquois. And then, of course, later, after that, their mascot became known as the Iroquois Chiefs. Well, of course, we know that there's been controversy about Native American names and a debate about whether or not it's appropriate for Native American imagery and names to be the mascots of school districts and professional teams and college teams. And we've seen many teams, several teams, get rid of, under pressure, in some instances, get rid of their Native American imagery and mascots. Well, in Iroquois, the name of the school district is actually Native American, and the reason that name was chosen was because of the Seneca Native American communities that lived in the three towns that, among others, but the three towns that now make up the Iroquois Central School District. However, if you delve into that history, and I know that, from the news reports and people who do remember, that the name was chosen to honor the Native Americans who lived there. However, if you go into the history, the Buffalo Creek Reservation was actually part of Marilla and Elma, and it stretched across what is Lackawanna, West Seneca today, and it stretched across, and it was a tract of land that after the Revolutionary War, as the U.S. government was divvying up land throughout western New York, they set aside Native American reservations, and the Native Americans who lived throughout this area lost their land in the Treaty of the Big Tree and other things after the Revolutionary War. And so the Buffalo Creek Reservation was one of the reservations that was set aside for the Native Americans, the Seneca Nation. But then in the 1840s, it became really inconvenient for the city of Buffalo or points north and where we are in East Aurora. We couldn't have railroads technically go through the reservation, and there was this pressure. The settlers were pressuring that area and the reservation. So in the 1840s, and it was part of the Indian removal that you'll hear about in American history, and they removed Native Americans. The U.S. government removed Native Americans to the West, and in the 1840s, the Buffalo Creek Reservation was essentially, still technically there, but essentially eliminated, and the Native Americans were removed. And then the towns of Elma formed out of that. Elma, Marilla, and other towns formed out of that. So the history is, honoring the people who once lived there. That is a very difficult history for Native Americans. And it's although there might be good intentions with naming the school district that, there has to be, I think, a discussion with the Seneca Nation about it, which has come out with statements about Native American imagery and mascots in school districts. So the state has come out with a statement saying that school districts can keep their names, Native American names, but need to get rid of the mascots, and there's an ongoing discussion. And we all have heard discussions on both sides of the issue, on multi sides of the issue, but I think what's missing is we just need to have the conversation and ask the Seneca Nation what they think. And a lot of people say, well, you know, what's wrong with it? The name, and as long as the imagery is respectful, that and honors the Native Americans who once lived here and who continue to live here, what's wrong with it? Well, we need to ask the Seneca Nation, and we need to ask the Native American community what they think. Because just because you want to honor somebody doesn't mean they have to accept the honor. And I think that's the part that's missing. And a discussion with the Native American communities, the Seneca Nation of Indians, to see what their input is, and not be afraid to make adjustments. And there could be a compromise, perhaps, but we won't know that unless we have that discussion and discuss that history. Like Iroquois, the Iroquois name, and that's seen as an issue, but also the history of Native Americans living in our community is very complicated, going back to the Buffalo Creek Reservation and the Indian removal acts of the federal government. And our local history was part of that, and where Native Americans were sent west and lost their land. So there's a complicated history there. And in fact, you might be, the folks back in the 1950s might have been attempting to honor a group of folks who lived around here for a long, long time. The Seneca Nation was the last group of humans who lived here for thousands and thousands of years. And so that history is really complicated. And so it's I think that's something that we need to delve more into when we're discussing naming our sports teams and things like that. So I think this is a good time to be looking back at that history. And we also have to remember that we're in a different time today than we were in the 1950s, 1960s, 70s, even the 1980s. So there's an exhibit at the town hall of Native American artifacts, and we actually put a little note on it because the imagery of there are drawings, there were tools and arrowheads and things in this exhibit, and then there's some sketches that accompany these artifacts, and the sketches they come from a very 1960s and 1970s perspective of Native American life in our community before that. And of course, this is pre-Seneca, so not even the Seneca Nation. This was before them. And we made this little note because today we understand a lot more, and our viewpoints, we still have a long way to go, but our viewpoints are much different about what Native American life was like as the settlers came in and before the reservations, we're understanding a lot more about it. For instance, there's this one local history book that I point to quite a bit, and they were talking about early settlers in the community, and they talked about a harsh winter and how one of the early settlers opened their home to a couple of the Native Americans who were living here at the same time and let them sleep by the fire, and essentially insinuated in this local history book written by, the people who live here today, insinuating that the Native Americans would not have made it through that winter unless they had the generosity of the settlers, the white European descent settlers, opening their home and allowing them to sleep next to the fire. And I'm like, well, this is crazy, because these Native Americans who lived here, Seneca and even before that, had lived here for thousands of years with no trouble. So it wasn't as if they didn't know how to survive a winter. And so again, that local history book was written from a very one-sided from the perspective of us, the current people who live here, and the settlers, from the perspective of the pioneer settlers, not the people who had lived here for thousands of years and probably did just fine and survived, were able to survive winters. So as we look at the history, we have to remember the perspective that it comes from, and that the perspective from 1950s and 60s is much different than it would perhaps be today, or even in 50 years from now as we work to learn more. So as we look at these Native American and any mascots, I think it's really important to go back in history and see why they were chosen, and perhaps it's not a bad idea to revise and outright change. There may be some compromises, but I was appalled, frankly, when the Washington Redskins. There were people defending that name. I don't know how you defend that name. I just don't. And there are certain things that just shouldn't. Those names are just, in my opinion, I don't care how much tradition is behind it and how long you've used the name. As we learn more, and that's the whole point of history, learning history, is that that name was just inappropriate. And there's still an NFL team, and I won't mention their name, you know who it is, but they begin their games by hitting a drum, a Native American drum, and that's how they get the crowd going. And that just does not seem like it's honoring Native Americans. So when people make the argument, well, it's actually honoring Native Americans and some of this imagery, I don't necessarily agree with that. And especially when you look at the history of it, it may not be, and it may be from a perspective that is outdated. But we should, regardless, be bringing people into the conversation, learning the history of it from multiple perspectives, not just the local history book that was written by somebody who does not have the other perspective or multiple perspectives, and bring all the perspectives together. Because as I think one person brought up at a recent school board meeting when they were discussing Native American mascots was, as a white person living today, we don't have that perspective, and we need to bring it in. And so that's, I think, what we can learn from history and not be afraid to do that. So I think that's what we can learn from it, and go back and get the real story as to why these names were chosen. As we look back at our heritage and our history, and to be like, well, this is tradition. Sometimes maybe the tradition isn't worth keeping, or parts of it aren't worth keeping, and we can revise it. But we can't be afraid to do that and look back at the uncomfortable things that might have been decided in the past. And once we realize why things were decided, we might have a different perspective and might want to change the present. So I'll leave you with that. I'm glad we had a good discussion about this today, and I'm really, really welcoming, especially on this topic. I would love to hear your comments about this, so don't be afraid. You won't offend me. Put your perspective in the comments, or if you want to send something to me privately, that would be great as well, because this topic is not going to go away, I don't think, soon. And I hope we were able to discuss a little of the perspective from a historical perspective of the mascots. There we go. Okay, I will see you all next week. Again, Happy New Year. And again, if you're watching this later, not live, most of you don't watch live, feel free to comment, and I do read them. So thank you. We'll see you next time.